Welcome to yet another episode of Discourse, an archive of ideas. This initiative is curated by the Economic Society of Shri College of Commerce, aimed at expanding the horizon of students on policy matters and contemporary issues. Today, we are honored to be joined by Ms. M.V. Lee Badgett, who currently serves as a professor of economics and co-director of the Center of Employment Equity at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Having pursued her PhD in economics from UC Berkeley and bachelor's from the University of Chicago, Ma'am has left an indelible mark on the areas of economic inequality for LGBT people, including wage gaps, employment discrimination, and poverty, and on the global cost of homophobia and transphobia. Professor Badgett is also a Williams Distinguished Scholar at UCLA's Williams Institute, where she was the first research director. She has worked with prestigious organizations including the World Bank, United Nations Development Programme, US Department of State, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and Asian Development Bank, among others. An expert in legislative matters and litigation, she has authored and co-authored some venerated journals and books, including the likes of The Economic Case for LGBT Equality, Why Fair and Equal Treatment Benefits Us All, When Gay People Get Married, What Happens When Societies Legalize Same-Sex Marriage, and Sexual Orientation Discrimination, An International Perspective. Ma'am, we are extremely humbled to interact with academics such as yourself, who consistently push us to question and critique policies that are meant to enhance public welfare. Thank you for gracing us with your presence today. Today's discussion will revolve around one of the topics Ma'am has devoted a lot of her works to, and we are sure to reap gainful insights from the session. The economic case for LGBT equality remains a persistent and pertinent issue. The continued passing of discriminatory laws, people getting fired from jobs for their sexual orientation or gender identity, exclusion from intolerant families, and health effects of stigma all make it imperative to address the LGBT issues across economic sectors of the world. With Ma'am's learned insights, we hope all of us will have something to take back from this session and will gain a better understanding of the LGBT equality from an economic perspective. Before I hand it over to Professor Badgett, kindly note that the participants are requested to remain muted during the session and can put any and all questions they might have for Ma'am in the chat box. These questions will be taken up post the session. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Ma'am to share her thoughts.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint presentation. I hope you can see that. Let's see.
Yes, Ma'am, it's visible.
Okay.
Yes,
thank you. Thank you. It's always good to know there are people out there. Thank you so much for inviting me to this. I'm very honored to be part of your series on ideas. And I love the fact that the Economic Society is taking that on as a project. So kudos to you. And I'm very happy to have the chance to talk to you about what I think is a very important new idea about why, as a society, as a global society, we need to be thinking about inclusion, full inclusion of LGBT people. This is a global conversation, let's say. We could call it a debate, but I prefer to think about it as a conversation. Just to give you an example, though, of how complicated this can get. A couple of years ago, the Pew Research Center here in the US did a global study of 34 different countries and asked people in those countries, should society accept homosexuality? And now, so rather than squint and try to figure out all those little numbers there, just for a second, take an impressionistic kind of look at this slide. On the right-hand side, those bars in green are the percentage of people who say, yes, society should accept homosexuality. On the left-hand side, the blue bars are pointing towards the numbers of people who say, no, society should not accept homosexuality. And the first thing to just notice is there's a huge amount of variation around the world. Some countries are very accepting, some countries are moderately accepting, and some countries are not accepting at all. If we zoom in just a little bit, we could see what India looks like. This is a clump of countries in the Asia region, broadly defined, and you can see that India is kind of not the most accepting country according to this particular poll, but also not the least accepting either. So it's kind of interesting. There are a lot of people who appear to be somewhat undecided about this question. In the United States, in contrast, back here, you can see that we are, relatively accepting, 72%, although we have a long way to go to reach the levels of acceptance in some Northern European countries. So it is a conversation that we are having everywhere, this question about inclusion. The other thing that's interesting that I'll point out is that when the Pew Research Center did this study, they also had this slide where they compared the attitude question, how many people are accepting of homosexuality, to the GDP per capita in the countries that they were surveying. And they show here in this just simple plotting of that data a very clear positive correlation. In general, wealthier countries tend to be more accepting of homosexuality. That's their bottom line on in the title right there of their slide. And I want to talk about why this makes sense. The attitudes normally fall into other kinds of social sciences, but how does that connect exactly to economics? It's going to be through this relationship. So that's what I want to explore with you today. So normally, it's a pretty straightforward kind of logic to think that LGBT inclusion is good for LGBT people. But how do we get this other kind of connection of LGBT inclusion being good for our economic output in our countries? And I'm going to argue that it's basically through our what we call in economics human capital, the skills, the knowledge, the creativity that people have that doesn't get used up. So that's why we kind of think about it as capital. That human capital that gives economic potential that is blocked, stymied, not used fully when we are not inclusive of LGBT people. And we'll take a little tour through how this works in the sectors of education, employment, health, and what it looks like from the perspective of businesses, which I suspect is something many of you are curious about. Starting with education, this young man, Pema Dorji, is now a gay activist in Bhutan, where he grew up. And while he was growing up, he recalled that going to school was like, in his words, going to a war. This experience that LGBT students have in schools is unfortunately very common around the world. UNESCO did a study where they reviewed data from 94 different countries in the world, so about half of the countries in the world, that all showed that bad experiences like bullying and discrimination and even violence are all too common for LGBT young people, or for people who are sexual and gender minorities of some kind, or those who are simply not conforming to our standard views of what gender looks like for individuals. So they found that bullying is very common and that it hurts LGBT students. And some other, in a few countries where we have more research, we have seen that bullying is bad for LGBT students in many ways. It results in poor mental health for students, as I show here, but it also lowers their grade point average. It makes them more likely to be absent from school. It makes them less likely to continue on to university after they've completed their primary schooling. And it's there are other problems that it causes that hold back how much knowledge people can actually absorb and are exposed to and are formally taught who are LGBT. And that is reducing the quantity and quality of the human capital that is being produced in our educational systems, in all of our educational systems, just because someone is LGBT. An interesting point that I will add is that there's a growing body of research that suggests that actually bullying in general hurts schools, and it hurts everybody in schools. Bullying creates a climate that does not appear to be very conducive to learning. There are some studies that show, for example, that average math scores are lower in schools that have a lot of bullying compared to schools that don't have a lot of bullying. So there's definitely a broader kind of context that we can also be thinking about some of these effects in. So that's on the education side. And I mentioned that that kind of treatment of LGBT young people is bad for their mental health. It turns out that that kind of treatment, that kind of stigma, violence, discrimination, being told that you're different is something that creates what people in health scholars call minority stress. And that minority stress makes you sick. We see big health disparities between LGBT people and the rest of the population in many different countries where we're getting research from good data. Actually, the data question is something that's fun to talk about if you're interested later. But for example, we see that LGBT people tend to have higher levels of anxiety and depression. They have higher rates of substance use, alcohol and drugs. They are more likely to think about suicide. They are more likely to have HIV, and they're more likely to experience physical violence. So that shows that the bad treatment, exclusion, is bad for health. And I will argue what economists take for granted, which is that health also hurts how productive people can be. If you're not healthy, you're not going to be able to work as much. If you're not healthy, you're not going to have the energy to do your best work in your position. And so you may be less productive. So health is yet another form of human capital, along with education and knowledge. And that's another link in terms of how exclusion holds back our economies. The good news is that we're starting to learn that we can do things about that. And the biggest one that we've studied so far, and one that does seem to make a big difference, has to do with public policies. Places that have more inclusive policies have lower health disparities. We see this around the United States. And our states are quite varied in their treatment of LGBT people, just as my understanding is just as states in India are. And that variation seems tied to public policies. So we see smaller health disparities where we have more inclusive public policies. Likewise for countries with more inclusive policies tend to have lower health disparities as well. So that's the second prong. And then, of course, I've mentioned this a few times, thinking about the workplace. All of these things are what we see in the workplace as I'm talking about them in this context. So we know that differential treatment continues in the workplaces all over the world. We have many studies that ask people, ask LGBT people, have you experienced inequality in the workplace, or have you experienced some kind of unfair treatment? And over and over again around the world, many LGBT people report yes. The slide I have up here is just an example of a study from the EU just a couple of years ago, where they reported that 1 in 5 people in the EU who are LGBT report some kind of discrimination at work in the last 12 months. Again, the experience varies across countries, as you can see here. Actually, in the United States, that figure, interestingly, is about the same. About 1 in 5 people tend to report that. I did a study with some colleagues looking at data on people in China. And again, 1 in 5 people who are LGBT have reported recent discrimination. I don't know that that's like a global figure. The studies I've seen in India tend to be more limited to certain subgroups of the LGBT population. But again, there's lots of self-reporting of experiences of discrimination by LGBT people in India. There are other ways we also see this unequal treatment. For one, and 10, 15 different countries in the world, we now have data where we can compare the wages of LGBT people to those who are not LGBT. This is a very common way we look for discrimination in economics. Sociologists also do a lot of this kind of work. And we see repeatedly the same pattern actually across countries, which is that there are lower wages for gay and bisexual men than there are for heterosexual men. Once you control for all the other things that tend to affect wages, like education, for example, and age, and where people live, their marital status, those differences are still there. They're still very clearly there. And there's roughly speaking about an 11% gap, one study suggests, on average around the world. So gay and bisexual men are earning about 11% less than heterosexual men who look very similar in terms of their characteristics. For women, there's a different pattern, and I didn't put it up here because it's a little bit more complicated. We could talk about it some. If you look at lesbian and bisexual women and heterosexual women, actually the lesbian and bi women tend to do better than heterosexual women do. But all three of those groups of women earn less than men do, so there's still a very big gender gap for everyone. But we think that lesbian and maybe bisexual women have more experience in the workplace that helps increase their wages compared to heterosexual women. So it's not really an advantage or a positive discrimination. It's much more that there's just some differences we can't quite control for, I think. That's something else that we could talk about if you're interested. And then finally, we're starting to get some very good experimental evidence that shows differential treatment. Here's the test. Given that many of you either are or will soon be looking for jobs, you can easily imagine this, I think. When you apply for a job and send out a resume with your experience, that's what employers have to look at to decide whether to invite you for an interview. So scholars have taken that process and said, let's take a resume of someone with a certain set of characteristics, and let's repeat it for a second person. But for that second person, we're also going to try to indicate that they are LGBT. And there's different ways that that's been done. For transgender people, they say, I have past work experience under a different name, or they have a certain set of pronouns that may flag the fact that they're transgender. For LGBT people, we might say that you are part of the LGBT society at your university, and that may be something that employers tend to notice. And what we see is that they do seem to notice that. There's a clear disadvantage for the LGBT resume person, this fictional person that we create. They are less likely, statistically significantly less likely to be invited for an interview. And a couple of studies have actually shown that that follows through at later stages of the job process as well. So there's really very clear research that shows that there is differential treatment of LGBT people, that there's discrimination against LGBT people in the workforce. Now, what effect does that have? In economics, in the very mainstream economics that many of you are probably learning, we learned that if you're not if employers are not hiring based on productivity, then they are creating a form of inefficiency. If they don't like a certain group of people and are willing to hire people from another group that are even less qualified because of their discrimination against the first group, then we will see inefficiency. We will see people not assigned according to their productivity to jobs. And so we see that in many different ways. First of all, we see it in the context of walls that are sometimes built around jobs. This is sometimes very common in public sector jobs, especially in the military, for example. And in some cases, schools have been sites where there are walls around certain kinds of jobs. They don't want LGBT people to hold jobs in teaching in some places. Secondly, there are funnels that push people into certain jobs. We call this occupational segregation. But they're pushed into those jobs because of stereotypes, basically, about who they are and what they might be good at. And we see a fair amount of occupational segregation for LGBT people. Some of that might be because people prefer certain kinds of jobs. but there's also some evidence that there are some barriers to certain kinds of jobs. And so there's that sort of funneling away from the job that might be best for an LGBT person. Third, there are these kinds of invisible fences that that people don't realize are there to block their progress. Sometimes people call this the lavender ceiling, but there are barriers to promotion or to moving into other kinds of jobs that are not so visible, but that are very clearly present. They're shaping the outcomes for LGBT people. And then finally, there's the closet. The fact that being LGBT is not a visible characteristic means that people have the option of disclosing that identity or not. And I think some people think that it can be protective against discrimination. And indeed, it might be in certain kinds of situations. That said, it also comes with its own set of costs for people, which may, again, kind of come back to some of those health costs. There are some studies that show very clearly that not being able to disclose your sexual orientation takes some psychic energy. It's not an absence of something. It's not simply just not talking about who you are. It's actually holding back on something, and that takes energy. That psychic energy can also reduce what you have for your job. So it's another way that we see that people may be less productive not because of who they are, but because of the situations that they're in and how they expect other people to treat them. They expect other people to treat them poorly because that's what they've seen in other kinds of contexts. So for employers, thinking about these kinds of dynamics is very important, because what we're talking about are things that employers care very deeply about. If they've got situations where their workers are lower productivity than they could be, if workers are more likely to leave and cannot be retained, that's a cost to businesses, because they have to incur hiring costs, the time and money to hire someone else, and then they have to train that person. So there are many ways that this is harmful potentially to employers. And increasingly, in many different labor markets of the world, employers will have a harder time recruiting LGBT workers because of the perception that they may not be good places to work. If LGBT people don't see the kinds of policies of non-discrimination and full inclusion, they may be less likely to work there. And non-LGBT people increasingly are saying that they look for those kinds of policies as a way to assess how inclusive an employer is, very generally, very broadly. How much do they actually cultivate a broad kind of creativity for their employees? How much are they really interested in reaching out to large numbers of markets, et cetera, et cetera. So it becomes an important signal in many different countries for employees. So increasingly, what we see is that employers themselves are making what they call a business case for LGBT equality. It's very close to this case that I'm making here. And we see names of businesses that you know. These are businesses based in the US. There are many businesses that operate, that are based in India or homegrown in India, that are also increasingly making these kinds of arguments. But they themselves made this argument to our Supreme Court in the United States that discriminatory laws impede business efforts to recruit and hire and retain the best workers, and to have them be able to work in an environment that enables them to perform at their best. So this is what businesses are saying themselves about this. And that is backed up by actually quite a bit of research at this point we have. So just for a few examples, we know that having more LGBT positive or LGBT inclusive policies in a company lead to higher stock prices for those companies. There are financial benefits, higher profits for those companies. There's higher productivity, some studies have shown. And there's at least one really interesting study in the United States that shows that companies operating in our states that have non-discrimination laws are actually able to create to attract a more creative workforce. So policy matters in this kind of context too. Companies have argued, take away policies that discriminate and give us policies that are going to help us recruit and retain the best workforce. So this is a lot of this research has started out in the United States because we're a little bit farther along in terms of collecting data on what businesses are doing, but I think it will become easier to do this kind of research in other countries, in India in particular. Certainly, these similar kinds of arguments have been made. Oh, actually, I happen to have this right here. By Parmesh Shahani, who was a leader at Godrej Industries for many years, working on all sorts of D&I issues. He has this great book called Queeristan that if you haven't read it, you should definitely read it. It puts all of these kinds of questions into the Indian context. So businesses in many places in the United States and elsewhere are increasingly taking action based on this set of beliefs that's backed by research and their own experience, that they need laws that are more inclusive. So we see them, sometimes we see them very visibly taking stands in the marriage equality national votes that have been taken in Taiwan, in Australia, in Ireland, some parts of the US. We have seen businesses stand up very clearly for marriage equality. So that's a great example that we've seen in many different places. And sometimes quietly, they will talk to leaders in different countries about the need for having more inclusive laws and policies. They need to be able to move their employees from one place to the other. Sometimes they want to have inclusive workplaces for everyone, even when, no matter where they're based. So they want to have the same set of policies that they apply in all of their operational locations. And sometimes they say that they will actually, in a sense, cast a vote with their feet in terms of their investments. So one example where this happened very, very visibly a few years ago was in North Carolina, a southern, very conservative state. It's actually the state where I was born. And the state of North Carolina enacted a law that basically required discrimination against transgender people. And because of that law, several businesses that were planning to open locations in North Carolina announced that they would be taking those locations elsewhere in the United States. Some of them decided not to undergo expansions of locations there because of the law that North Carolina passed. Some of the big athletic associations in the U.S. Basketball is a very big sport in North Carolina, and the national tournament was scheduled to be there, and that association said we're going to move it somewhere else because of North Carolina's discriminatory policies. Big blow. Bruce Springsteen, major international star, rock star, said he would not perform there. So these examples were part of a much larger wave of losses that amounted to billions of dollars, about $4 billion, according to one count, for the businesses and economy, not simply, but because they were enacting transgender discrimination. So I think this is important for us to understand and to take into account when we're thinking about consequences of laws and policies, both good and bad, and for thinking about who allies are for change. So we've talked about this at the individual LGBT person level in terms of how things look, in schools, with related to health, with related to employment, and then how businesses look at these issues. I think the last step that's important for making this case for equality is to think about what it would look like from a country level. If inclusion is good for countries, and we should see for countries' economies, then we should see economies with more inclusion doing better. That's kind of like that one of the very first slides that I showed you with that correlation with GDP. And there's a couple different ways that we have approached this. We sort of global band of scholars working on this issue. One is to take all those individual pieces, education and health and employment, and try to put monetary costs to those losses and to add that up. Because remember, those were losses to individuals, but also to their prospective, potentially the prospective employers, but really more generally for the economy as a whole. So actually, the very first study that I did, that we've done to do this was one for India. I undertook a study for the World Bank, who wanted to know what was the cost of homophobia and transphobia in India. And so I took some data on health disparities. I did not have any good data that I felt like I could use for education. So I have a few health disparities and evidence of discrimination. And I took that estimate of lost productivity from wage gaps and the health effects, looking at the higher rates of certain kinds of health effects, depression, suicidality for LGBT people in India, and calculated how many years of work might be lost from those disparities, and attach monetary values to them. And it added up to about 1% of GDP. I'll come back to that in a second, but just I want to note that doing something very similar in lots of countries now. We've done this in the Philippines. I did this in the Philippines. Someone else has done this in Kenya, someone else in South Africa. We've got some studies now from Eastern Europe and from the Caribbean countries. These similar approaches have landed on roughly similar levels of impact on country level economies. 1% of GDP is kind of the range that it seems to kind of point to. And although that sounds like a small number, 1%, let me try to put it into a different context. If our larger economies, our macroeconomies, saw a drop of 1% of GDP, we would actually call that a recession. We'd be very concerned about it. Most countries' leaders would be trying to do something about it. Maybe this kind of exclusion is really putting all of our economies in a permanent recession. That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is just to say, well, 1% of GDP, 1% of global GDP is really the size of the whole economy of Turkey or the whole economy of the Netherlands. And those are important countries. I don't think we would say that that's really would make a small difference if those countries' economies suddenly disappeared. That would be a big problem. So if it's a problem for our macro economy to drop, if it's a problem to just sort of lose a whole country's economy, I would argue it's important for us to think about what happens when we lose that much output by how we treat LGBT people. So here's the second way to look at it, is to go back to this correlation. This is just a simple plotting of points. What I've done with in several different studies with different groups of colleagues is to say, what happens if we control for all the other things that we think affect the size of economies? So looking at broadly at the level of education in a country and other measures of human capital, looking at the capital stock, looking at the levels of trade, looking at other kinds of important variables. Let's hold those constant and see what happens when we look just at measures of inclusion of LGBT people. So we've used a lot of legal measures of inclusion, and we've also used measures that are more about different. We have a measure called the Global Acceptance Index, which captures variation of public opinion around the world. We've used that, we've put them together. But what we always find is that GDP is clearly correlated with the level of inclusion, even after we've controlled for other kinds of factors. The first study we did looked just at emerging economies that included India, and we found that one additional right for LGBT people added was associated with an additional $320 of GDP per capita. That was about 3% of GDP. And a larger study where we added many more countries and that did something fairly similar, we found that one additional right added more than $1,000 of GDP per capita. So this included many more wealthy countries. So the correlation meant a much larger change in GDP. So we have this economic case that you can see very clearly at all these different levels, different ways of measuring it at the individual level, at the business level, at the country level. And I want to end by talking a little bit about why this matters. Why do we need an economic case for equality? We have a very good human rights argument, I think, and there have been many groups around the world making that argument in different contexts that LGBT people or LGBTI people, as we are increasingly including intersex people, deserve the same human rights as everyone else. And there are many different ways that's been shown. And the human rights argument has been very important for moving us closer to full inclusion of LGBT people. But I think there's still some room for other arguments. The human rights argument is one that it also takes a lot of effort to convince people of in some places. And maybe another idea will help with that. That's the economic case. Secondly, there are lots of places that just by their very nature, by the way they're constructed and what their goals are, they are not necessarily going to be very amenable to human rights arguments. So businesses, for example, are accountable to their owners or to their shareholders for producing returns for them. And human rights is very rarely a very big factor in what they're looking for, what the owners and shareholders are looking for. So businesses need an argument that's much more like the economic case to be able to justify what they do to people who have some who will hold them accountable in some ways. Secondly, we have a whole financial sector that globally that it's a business, but it's also a little bit more than that. It's kind of what keeps everything else going. And likewise, they are not expected to make monetary policy or fiscal policy or to do lending to banks, et cetera, because of human rights, but they might care about something that affects the economy. And then finally, and in fact, the first place that this argument was developed had to do with development banks and agencies, places like the World Bank and other multilateral and bilateral development agencies who are there to promote shared prosperity in the mission of the World Bank, shared prosperity and lower poverty. And for them to take on an issue like LGBT inclusion, they had to be able to connect it to their core mission. And so the economic case allows them to do that. So here are some of the different ways that it's been used, and I think these are some logical extensions of this argument. First of all, to change laws and policies. As I mentioned, places with better laws and policies that are more inclusive tend to have stronger economies and to have LGBT people who are healthier and more productive. Secondly, we're learning that we really need to have better data. This is a big problem for researchers. We're not the people that most folks care about, but we know that we can use data. We can use better data to measure and monitor progress towards a more inclusive world. I've been involved with an effort with the UN Development Program to create an LGBTI inclusion index in different parts of the world. And we're starting now to pilot that index. So that's an example of one broad effort to help us know whether countries are inclusive now and whether they become more inclusive over time. I think also recognizing that this argument, I think, to make this work, it's going to require a lot more resources for LGBTI organizations. If you have taken economics classes, you have probably heard the phrase, the invisible hand. Some people believe that the power of self-interest is strong enough that will drive companies and countries, should drive companies and countries on their own to seek out more inclusive policies for LGBT people because it's in their self-interest. It's an interesting argument. There may be something to it, but I also have seen kind of behind the scenes how this really works in businesses and in different kinds of agencies. They don't tend to, business leaders don't tend to wake up in the morning saying, oh, you know, I forgot that we need to have better policies for LGBTI people. No, they're hearing from their employees, they're hearing from outside organizations urging them to take actions to become more inclusive. There has to be a very visible hand doing that work. And it's almost always done by LGBTI people to start with. The last thing I want to point to as an implication actually is kind of a jumping off point for me in terms of new research that I'm doing that I just want to give you like just the teeny tiniest hint about because I'm very interested and excited about it. I've argued that we need more inclusion of LGBT people because of what they have to contribute to their economies. And a piece of that argument, I think, is also to think about the broad range of LGBTI people. What we've learned in the US is that actually LGBT people are more likely to be poor, to have very low incomes than are non-LGBT people in the US. And it's made visible a group of people that often are invisible in most countries, which are the people who are who have lower incomes. And sometimes they have lower incomes in low-income countries, low to middle-income countries, developing countries, and do not appear to be very well served by existing development efforts, and yet they have much to contribute if they have the opportunity. So this project that I'm doing, which I call the LGBTI Livelihoods Project, is designed to better understand what the barriers and needs are for low-income people, and then to use economic development efforts that we've used in other contexts, like for gender equality, to use that to expand the opportunities and well-being for LGBT people as well. And here's kind of what we found. And some research that I've done, including with a colleague in India, is to just see where there are projects that are dealing directly with LGBTI people's economic well-being. And we found 59 projects in about 23 or more countries. And they are, as you can see on this slide, this is just giving you a sense of who's being targeted by those programs. Most of them are very broadly defined, but it's interesting because we see a very large effort, relatively speaking, towards providing opportunities for transgender people. So we do see that transgender people face some of the biggest barriers, some of the highest rates of discrimination in countries around the world. So it's not surprising, I think, that we're seeing transgender people being targeted. We don't see a big targeting of lesbian and bisexual women, even though I think they also face many barriers, partly because the gender barriers are on top of the ones that they face as lesbians or bisexual women. But we aren't seeing a huge number of projects targeted at them. And actually, I'll just say that many of these transgender projects do come from South Asia, India being a big location for many of them. So what are these projects doing? This gives us a little bit of a sense of what the needs are. So a lot of them are about starting businesses. They're building social enterprises that will employ LGBTI people. Many of them, the biggest category is about providing skills to LGBTI people, vocational skills, other kinds of skills. Some of these projects are done in the public sector. We have many of them about helping people become entrepreneurs and giving them micro loans. We have many that are about helping people find jobs. So we're starting to get a sense of what the needs are for skills, for becoming entrepreneurs, especially in economies with very large informal sectors, and for help connecting with jobs in the formal sector. So I think there's still a lot of work to do to enact this this idea, and I, my own direction, as I said, right now is to head towards opportunities to use this idea in other parts of the LGBTI community that often get left behind. With that, I'm going to stop and see if you all have any questions or thoughts. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such an interesting and enriching session. Extremely, I hope that I'm sure that people like the audience would have got a different lens of this case, and we discussed so many different ideas about it. So with your permission, we'll now move on to some questions from the audience. Okay,
That
ma'am.
sounds good.
So just as you mentioned in your address, while studies suggest some economic losses caused due to the LGBTQ plus exclusion, which is a large proportion of world leaders, especially in developing countries, who haven't stood up to this challenge. So, ma'am, do you think that this is primarily due to the fact that such costs are implicit and thus don't ostensibly have a tangible outcome, or is there something else to play here?
So do they have a tangible outcome, or what's going on? Yeah, it's complicated, I think. There's politics and there's economics, they come together, and it's hard to know sometimes exactly what direction they will go. I think sometimes the conversation or debate about LGBTI people is couched in a very emotional way. Sometimes it's rooted in religion. Sometimes it's rooted in the need for politicians to appear to be agreeing with their constituents on something that they care about. So we've seen that in some countries where at election time politicians become more anti-LGBT just to appeal to their base. So those things do matter. I think the advantage of the economic case is that it takes away some of the emotion. It shifts it off the plane of thinking about religion and says there are broader consequences, not just to LGBTI people. And those are real and those are important, but it has consequences for our economies as well. I would say too, I think the other thing that we've learned from the COVID pandemic is that our health, our public health is connected across borders as well. Economic trade obviously is very important, but so is kind of the movement of people and good health or bad. So I think it's partly a matter of introducing this as an argument and trying to develop it to just send it in a different direction that might be politically more palatable.
Yes, ma'am, I do agree with that. Another question that we have is that a study by Berggren and Ellender, 2012, proposes that tolerance of LGBT people might diminish productivity. So they argue that conservative groups in a country might be intolerant of homosexuality, and their discomfort could lead them to take less productive jobs to avoid working with LGBT people. Or they might avoid moving to tolerant countries. So, ma'am, do you think that these costs might be mitigated in order to ensure inclusivity while also maintaining productivity of all communities?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. I think the Berggren and Ellender paper has some things that I don't think are very good about it, and those mechanisms that they propose I think are worth thinking about. Ethically speaking, I think when countries are moving towards a time when their laws and policies are becoming more tolerant of people with certain characteristics, that there are people who oppose that effort. And for example, in the United States, as we have, had a very long, complicated history around racial equality, as we started moving towards laws and policies in the 1960s that were more inclusive of African-American people and condemned discrimination based on race, there were many white people who did not like that. And I think we had to have a conversation about how much weight to give to people with opinions like that. And I think the eventual decision was that they should not be weighted very heavily. That what that meant was continuing to allow discrimination. We're having those conversations now with respect to LGBT rights and the conflict of some people's religious values about which of those are most important to not to highlight, but to prioritize, let's just say. So I think there's an ethical level where that conversation it's hard to know. Like, if you have a policy of non-discrimination, then people who want to discriminate are simply being told, no, you can't do that. So we would not necessarily count that as a cost. But there's also an empirical question, is it true that people with who don't want to work with LGBT people might be less productive? It's not obvious to me exactly what that would mean. It could be that it's about whether they will agree to actually really work with someone who's LGBT. Will they reject interactions and try to avoid them? There, I think it's a very different kind of argument than what I'm making. I mean, the argument that I'm making is that the cost is much more rooted in the individual people who face discrimination and are held back in some way by that. So that example of somebody who wants to discriminate and will just continue to discriminate is exactly what's causing the cost to LGBT people. So it's not really a cost to the intolerant person necessarily. And then finally, I'll say on the immigration question, there are many reasons why people move, it's possible that people would look at the laws of a particular country and decide not to move. But again, there's no evidence of that I know of. In fact, the sort of anecdotal evidence that I know of suggests just the opposite, that people are very willing to move to prosperous high-income countries, even though they may have laws that sort of go against their own religious beliefs. So in the Netherlands, for example, they kind of faced this issue. For a while, they were concerned that some of the people immigrating to the Netherlands were people who had very different views about gender and about sexual orientation and LGBT people, and they wanted to make sure that people knew that where they were going had these laws and policies, these different norms, and people still wanted to move there. So I don't think that that is likely to be a very big barrier. So it's an interesting possibility, but the question that I have is, where's the evidence? It's just not really there.
Right. Thank you so much for answering that question, ma'am. Moving on, what economic ideology does rainbow washing stem from? And how, according to you, can this insensitive practice be put to an end?
Yeah, rainbow washing, kind of like pink, I think we call it pink washing here in the States. But yeah, the idea that companies want to look good, this is kind of how we normally think about it. They want to look good by appealing in a very superficial way, when in fact they're actually not doing the real work inside their organizations to be more inclusive of LGBT people. Or some people have also used that to refer to practices at a country level. For example, countries like Israel kind of touting their human rights record on LGBT issues, while they are have a very, very poor human rights record when it comes to Palestinians. So at the company level, I think there are the best way to fight against that is to have good information. So if you've got better data on what their policies really are and how well they're working, it makes it much harder for companies to claim that they are truly inclusive and supportive of LGBT people when they are not. Yeah, so getting that kind of data, I think, is very important. We have a growing number of indexes around the world of businesses. I believe there's one in India now showing, kind of tracking how well businesses are doing. And so I think that's one way to hold companies' feet to the fire, so to speak, and make them accountable, is to ask them for that kind of data to show that they are not just using words, but that they're actually walking the talk, as we would say.
Right. That makes sense, ma'am. Thank you. But if you have some more time to spare for us, we can just take another question, or we can end here.
Sure.
Whatever
Yeah,
works
one
for
more.
you.
Let's do one more. Yeah.
Right. So, all right. Last question for you would be, according to a pilot survey conducted by the World Bank, discrimination against LGBT people in India could be costing the country's economy up to $32 billion, which is a huge amount every year in lost economic output. Do you think the decriminalization of homosexuality is enough to make drastic changes in this number? Or is it a voluntary mindset shift of the masses that is imperative?
Yeah, I don't think decriminalization is enough. Yeah, so that was the study that I referred to that I did for the World Bank. And it was done before India decriminalized homosexuality and before the transgender, the Supreme Court decision that gave transgender people rights. So that's an important step. That was actually one of the measures in our legal measure in that comparison of countries, was decriminalization. But I think we're beyond that now. So, I mean, I think that's a very clear example of a barrier that sometimes was used to keep people out of certain jobs, to say, oh, if you're homosexual, you're a criminal, or if you're transgender, you're a criminal. And so we can't allow you to work with children or be in the military or whatever. And so that has definitely been a barrier, but there are many others, as you kind of put it, about the hearts and minds of the masses. I think that does mean that full equality, full inclusion does require a much broader kind of commitment, because it happens on an everyday basis. Homophobia and transphobia happen and potentially happen in any kind of interaction, whether it's with your family, your neighbors, the shopkeepers that you patronize, or your workplace. So there are many different opportunities for LGBT people to potentially be told, you are less worthy as a human being. You are not somebody I'm going to treat equally. And so that getting to that depth is a longer and harder road than simply decriminalizing. So I think that's very important. Actually, I'll just say that in the UNDP Inclusion Index, LGBTI Inclusion Index, we want to capture some of that. So we asked, some of the measures of inclusion are about public attitudes. They're also about the actual lived experience of LGBTI people, about what happens to them with regard to their earnings, what happens with regard to how much education they get, what their health is. So there are many ways that we have to really dig deeply to really know when LGBTI people are more fully included. So that's definitely a piece of it. I actually, there was a question in the chat. It might have only come to me from Pratibha Chatterjee, who said, I highly agree with the fact that human rights should have been enough to be inclusive of them, but yes, this economic case is a good motivation. I would really like to know more about why homosexual women are better in the workplaces than heterosexual women. So I think that is a really interesting question. So can I have another minute or two to address that?
Sure, ma'am.
Yeah, so I think it's important to think about how people's different identities come together. We call this intersectionality. And this is a really great example. We think that a lot of the the reasons why lesbian and bisexual women appear to do better in the workplace is because they have more experience. So look at it from this perspective. If you are a lesbian and you're thinking, okay, if I'm able to live my life as a lesbian fully, I will have a female partner, most likely, if I have a partner. I will not have a male partner who's going to earn a lot more than I do, who will be able to potentially support our entire family. So the question is, what will be my responsibility for supporting our family economically? So that's a very different kind of attitude that we think kind of pushes against the gender norms that often limit heterosexual women. So it might mean that lesbian and bisexual women have more freedom. They may feel more comfortable choosing jobs that have more men in them. And in fact, we do see this in a couple of countries from studying occupational segregation. So lesbians may go into those jobs that earn a little bit more, but mainly we think what's happening is that they are getting more experience. So for heterosexual women, either whose husbands don't want them to work in the workplace for pay, or women who have children and have family responsibilities that keep them out of the paid labor force, or I guess those are basically the two main dynamics, that they may just be working less of their life than are the lesbian and bisexual women. So that experience accumulates over time. And we also consider that to be an important kind of human capital, because what you learn on the job are things that are relevant for your job in a particular place, but they may also be transferable to other places. So we call that, again, that's human capital. So we think that it's just something that we can't quite measure. We don't have really, this gets, into the more the geekier weeds of how these studies are conducted. But basically, we don't really know how many years somebody has actually worked. We just know how old they are, and we know how much education they got. And the difference between those two is likely to be, that's at least their potential work time. For men, it tends to be very close to their actual working experience. For women, it tends to not be. It's become closer in many countries over the years, but it's still very different. But maybe for lesbians, it is very close, like with men, that they're not taking lots of time out of the labor force for children, or because of their family division of labor and the gender norms that go along with that. So that was kind of a long explanation, but I think it's a very interesting kind of idea that brings together the role of gender norms and expectations of women with maybe having a little more freedom for lesbian and bisexual women.
Thank you, ma'am. It was an extremely insightful answer. Thank you, ma'am. It was an absolute honor to host you. I believe I speak for everyone when I say that we got to learn a lot from this enriching session. On behalf of the Economic Society, SRCC, I extend to you my heartfelt gratitude for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. I would like to thank the audience as well for tuning in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be with you all.